Welcome to the Not Old Better Show. I'm your host, Paul Vogelsang. You've seen that flashy opening sequence of House of Cards season after season, and we all know that theme music. Here, generously supplied by cellist Jesse Ahmann. We'll have a link to Jesse's excellent cello website online. But back to House of Cards, and for those of us who binge on the Netflix program and obsess over each episode in detail, we can now walk the House of Cards Washington, D.C. tour and all of the locations, which are then led by House of Cards expert Kathleen Bashian. Kathleen Bashian is our guest today on the Not Old Better Show. But first, a tiny bit of background to set the stage for you. I had the pleasure of joining local historian Kathleen Bashian, where I learned about the symbolic meaning of all that great imagery, those figures, statues, and the history of the iconic places in Washington, D.C. that serve as a backdrop to the show. And for local viewers who are hooked on the House of Cards, part of the fun is watching uber power couple Frank and Claire Underwood in action and spotting all of the Washington locations, both stately and shadowy, that serve as the backdrop to their climb to the White House. If the motivations and deviations in the plots sometimes swerve beyond belief, the settings on this walking tour provide a very real geographic grounding in reality. As I say, I had the pleasure of joining Kathleen Bashian for a 2-mile walking tour that covers a wide variety of Washington locations against which the Underwoods' scheming affairs of state and affairs of a different kind all play out. And we'll listen to parts of the tour. Along the way, Kathleen offers insights into the history and background of the locations in House of Cards to give us a better appreciation of some of the show's memorable moments and how their very astute selection enhances the impact of the storylines and the characters in the House of Cards. So I want to listen for just a little bit as Bashian identifies the places in the ominous and oddly beautiful title sequence. This wonderful music is from that. So let's listen for just a bit as Bashian identifies the places in the ominous and oddly beautiful title sequence from which this music is taken, and we'll touch on, and we'll hear Kathleen touch on, a little bit about some of the obscure Ulysses S. Grant stop, the FBI building stop, the Justice Department, those of course where Solicitor General Heather Dunbar in the story has her offices, and we're going to recall some of the events both involving Claire and Frank Underwood at the memorial to James Garfield and other locations. Although Frank's favorite local spot for ribs, Freddy's Barbecue Joint, is simply an exterior on a Baltimore street, we are actually going to get a chance to conclude the tour at a barbecue restaurant where Kathleen Bashian is going to lead a great conversation amongst all of the participants in the tour about what's happened this last season and other seasons in the House of Cards, and what's going to happen, or certainly what we believe to be happening. So for fans of the House of Cards, this tour is fantastic. So join me as I talk to Kathleen, join the rest of the tour group as we ask Kathleen some questions, and hear some of those questions from the barbecue place where we conclude this wonderful 2-mile tour. The next tour is scheduled for November 5th, so I encourage everybody to check out the Smithsonian Associates website, where you can find all the details for the tour, all about Kathleen Bashian and everything else. But this is a great, very easy-going walking tour. So join us. Thanks.
The question of national security versus civil liberties is definitely raised in the House of Cards plot, and we think about the surveillance that's taking place, both with Gavin Dorsey with the web, but then you think of Leanne Harvey with the figure of Aidan McCollum, where they're checking everything from the top down.
Well, welcome to the Not Old Better Show, and a special welcome to Kathleen Bashian. Kathleen is the tour guide extraordinaire, just a brilliant, learned person with a great deal of background, talking to us today about the House of Cards walking tour. The House of Cards, of course, the famous television program, a great political program, very powerful about the workings of Washington and politics in general. And we've just listened to a little bit of the sounds of Washington, D.C., hearing the bells as they ring out 9 a.m. I joined Kathleen on her recent walking tour, part of the Smithsonian Associates series. And I spent the better part of a day. We got a chance to walk around a little bit of D.C., but I'm going to let Kathleen talk a little bit about that. So Kathleen Bashian, welcome to the Not Old Better Show as part of the Smithsonian Associates program.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Paul. Enjoyed our journey together along Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yes, I really did. And so everybody knows this is a tour, this is a walking tour of Washington, D.C. It's about 2 miles in length, but it's a nice pace. It goes in a very kind of, it's well led by you, of course. There are lots of stops. There are lots of places that you are giving some insights tour. But you had to have been a big fan of the show, prior to even starting some of this, because I know you do tours of other local kind of areas, but what was it about the House of Cards in particular that inspired you to do a tour of this type?
Well, Paul, actually, the initiative for me to even start watching the show came from visitors. I guide people from around the nation and the world, and I had a number of inquiries from visitors about the show. Many people hooked on it, and so I decided that I should be more informed about it. I also then did watch the show. Obviously, you do get hooked on this quickly, and I watched it again after I was doing the research for the tour that I was giving. But what I wanted to then do is clarify certain questions that came up, but also clarify certain misconceptions that might be derived from this tour, this show.
Yeah, and it is a popular show. It's on Netflix, of course, and I watch it. I'm a big fan. I guess when I joined the tour, I thought to myself, well, I kind of pay attention to, some of these things. I'm not necessarily a kind of insider or, inside the Beltway person per se. But one of the things that was just so fascinating, you use this great term. You talk about this intelligent design of the House of Cards, the plot, and then how the tour becomes very relevant to that. So talk a little bit about that, because I thought that was a really nice way of describing what it is that you're kind of joining here.
Well, the city lends itself to so many teachable moments, and along that corridor of Pennsylvania Avenue, for sure, they're chock-a-block, one after the other. But starting to do the research on House of Cards, I really was... I marveled and really was fascinated at that the designers of this show, the writers, did their homework. There were certain reasons why, especially that opening sequence where we get that flash of all of those buildings. And the more I studied those buildings and thought about how they figured into the plot, the more I marveled at the intelligent design of it. An example, we start early on at that Grant statue. Mm-hmm. And the Grant statue, it comes a number of times in it, the resolute lions, but also that view of Grant. And that really plays into the plot. Frank Underwood is a Southern boy, but he identifies with certain traits of Grant.
One of the things that I found very interesting, and your passion, of course, for this is, I think, first and foremost. But one of the things that was just so fascinating, Kathleen, was this tie-in to lobbying and the press. And so, talk a little bit about that and how that's woven into the plot and is such an enormous part of Washington, D.C.
Yes, lawyers and lobbyists. They say we are a city filled with politicians, lawyers, lobbyists, and the so many of the characters that we see, like Remy Denton, like the Marty Spinella early on.
Hmm.
We see them figuring as lobbyists and how important their role is. And many of them, the show shows us how these lobbyists move. They move from being in government out to the other side with the private sector, and then lobbying for causes because they have the connections. They also know the way politics runs, and that is that's very significant. And when I did more research on that, I mean, there are 11,000 lobbyists that are registered at the federal level. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry as well, so that also has significance for our city, for our nation.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is as well on the tour, you get into some details about this kind of confluence between the plot and how journalists and politicians kind of all use the media for self-promotion. And Frank is an expert at that, of course, but others are good at it too. And so it's a real part of the plot. So you must have spent a fair bit of time researching kind of this component, this journalist component in the Evening Star building we walk by. And so there's a lot of really important scenery as well as knowledge that you're bringing to this. And I imagine the research was fun for you to do even.
It was fun to do, and it is there. And of course, Pennsylvania Avenue, we hit it one building after the other. But it started with when I was thinking about that character way back when, the Zoe character, the journalist who was a cub journalist, but she was obviously wanting to get an inside ear, so she knew what was happening with Frank, but she was using this to promote her own career, but then to see how Frank was using it for his own agenda. And then you look at the likes of Raymond Tusk character who comes in later, and he is manipulating controlled leaks for his agenda. So it goes both ways. That was a real realization for me.
Well, you mentioned Zoe. She, of course, I don't want to give anything away for anybody who is going to be joining your tour or hasn't yet seen some of the episodes. But Zoe is Zoe and Metro are tied together quite a bit, and of course, some of the locations do involve real locations in Washington D.C. But in particular, one of the Metro stations, Cathedral Heights, mentioned in the show, doesn't really exist. But you're really kind of talking about these places as being almost characters unto themselves within the program, and certainly on the tour, we walk right by Metro Center.
We walk by the yes, Metro Center and the Archive Station as well. I think it's called Capitol Heights in the show, if I'm not mistaken about that. But anyway, the yes, Metro figures into the plot in a very, very dramatic way at the end of that first series, and Zoe's no longer a part of the plot then. Afterwards.
We're with Kathleen Bashian. Kathleen gives the tour titled the House of Cards Walking Tour. I have personally been on the tour, so I can tell you it is really one of the great things to do in Washington, D.C. The next tour is coming up November 5th. Is that right, Kathleen?
Yes, Saturday, November 5th.
And so the tour starts out close to the Capitol building, And then it meanders around a little bit down Pennsylvania Avenue and around, and it makes some nice stops there by the archive and the Navy Memorial and so forth, the Federal Triangle. I thought the other thing that I thought was really interesting to hear you talk about was this idea of the architecture of the city. Some of that ties into the plot of the House of Cards, but in particular the buildings that are very squat, and the FBI building is one in particular that you talk about that has this brutalism style of architecture, and that also factors into the plot a little bit too, right?
You have a number of characters who are actually either cooperating with the FBI or having to be are being investigated by the FBI. So that is something. And as I mentioned, when we're at the FBI now, that they have announced they're moving, that the campus, they call it, no longer suits their mission and purpose, and that is curious because as is seen in the show, there's so much surveillance taking place, and you look at that new brutalism architecture and you realize you can't do a lot of surveillance with that massive structure.
Right. Very true. It probably just doesn't work quite the same way with a building whose walls are, significantly thickened by rebar and other means to protect them.
Yes, yes, yes.
One of the really neat things, I think that, it's a treat. We get to go have ribs. We're not going to Freddy's Barbecue, famous on the program, but we're going to go have ribs, and it's part of that luncheon that's part of the tour that you offer, and it's really where the tour concludes. However, certainly the lecture and the information doesn't conclude at all at that point. As a matter of fact, you really led a very interesting conversation amongst all of the members of the group, and we had a big group where people were offering their own opinions of some of the direction. They were giving kind of the sense of some of the characters and storylines, and maybe some of the memorable moments that they had, and then you kind of brought all of that together for everyone and led people into this very interesting conversation of what might come.
I want you to continue eating, but I know a few people will be leaving after. So keep your eating, but we can start some food for thought discussion. Now, the ring. The ring. What does Frank say about the ring when he was questioned, but why he wore it? Do you remember? Well, he said it keeps my knuckles firm, but he said also gives me a moment to think. I think that was something. Now, what do you make of his burying the ring when he dedicates that wilderness? It's after he learns that his ancestor had died there. There's no right answer. This is all. And then other symbolism. This Mary Cassatt painting is the one they chose to use when Zoe sits down with him and says, "No more sex, but I still want you to be feeding me with information," which doesn't work then. But I thought of all the jewels in the collection of the National Gallery. Obviously, it would be a National Gallery painting because it's presumably taking place in D.C. And now, this I haven't gotten an answer to, but when Heather Dunbar, this is early in the season, and she is the special prosecutor of Raymond Tusk, and they're interviewing Tusk. It's all examining Garrett Walker, the then president's obstruction of justice issue. But they're meeting, you assume it might be a Department of Justice place, and Raymond Tusk walks in, and Dunbar stands up her stenographers. And I'm wondering, in a courtroom, it's usually the other way. The please rise, the judge is coming in. But that case, they had the prosecutor stand when Tusk came. So I don't know why that is. But any legal input on that? Not sure. Communication, I mentioned, is a leitmotif in this, and so we referred to this before, but we have this Gavin Dorsey character who's exploring through the dark web, and then we have the Aidan McCollum who's involved with the satellite looking down. And then there's always the gaffes made on television, which must try to be fixed later on in some kind of a PR control release. Now, Frank's sexual orientation. That's a very inexplicable, I guess is the word. And actually, I listened to I think he was attracted to Meacham, Tom Yates he was attracted to. This is Frank, his sentinel buddy. There's some suggestion that night when they're together. He refuses Claire's overtures at times, and yet he wants Zoe and doesn't want to give up with her. He doesn't champion the homosexual rights of, if you remember, Michael Corrigan, and who Heather Dunbar is willing to try to back. Claire is backing, and Frank backs off to that. So Beau Willimon was questioned. Well, what about Frank's sexual orientation? And Willimon says, and it's a quote, "He is a man with a large appetite and who says to himself, when I'm attracted to someone, I'm attracted, period." Any other speculation? I think he's right on with Heather and Jackie and well, the one last thing I think is what they do with the characters too, and it shows you something, it fleshes out a character. When Frank is trying to focus, what does he do? He polishes his shoes, he paints the Civil War figures, he plays violent video games. And those are all, three aspects of his character. You all probably know this, but I just recently learned that Claire was Jenny in Forrest Gump. That was one of her earliest roles, as Jenny. Yes, right. So she's come a long way to the Princess Bride to Ice Queen. Well, Natalia, it's been a pleasure spending this time with all of you, and great. Take care.
Well, it's just a brilliant tour by you, made all the more brilliant with your research, your insights, and your personal style and warmth. For all of my audience, I just encourage you on this upcoming November 5th, as well as ongoing dates with Kathleen Bashian. Join her. She's a historian. This is a walking tour, the House of Cards walking tour, that really covers such a nice wide variety of Washington locations. You get a real sense about the Underwoods, Frank and Claire, their scheming and all of their affairs, how they play out in our beautiful city. And then you get all of these wonderful insights from Kathleen Bashian. Kathleen, what a pleasure it was to be with you that day. I just loved it. So nice to meet you. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing. Again, Kathleen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Paul. You were such a wonderful, enthusiastic participant in this tour, and it's been a delight speaking with you.
Oh, well, thank you again. Well, we'll follow up with you. I'm looking forward to more tours and for lots more to come from Kathleen Bashian. You can find Kathleen at tour-dc.com. And I'll put links up on our site to where people can find you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye now.
Bye. Thanks to all my guests today, all the help on the podcast. Thanks to all.